Good morning, members of the Society. The next speaker that you're going to hear from is Greg Melick. I thought the best way to describe Greg's career is to use colours: green, black and red. The green. Greg joined the army as a private soldier. He was commissioned after seven years as an NCO and was appointed aide-de-camp to the Governor of Tasmania, a very distinguished governor, the first Australian to be Governor of Tasmania, and a former Chief Justice, Sir Stanley Burbury. He went on, I might say that after that, Sir Stanley had only Navy ODCs after Greg. He went on to command the Royal Tasmania Regiment. He rose in the ranks to become Deputy Chief of the Defence Force Reserves, and he's a Major General. He was appointed a member of the Military Division of the Order of Australia in 2005 and promoted to an officer of the Military Division in 2011. He holds various decorations, including the Reserve Forces decoration. In terms of the black, Greg graduated in law. He signed the bar roll in 1996. He took silk in 2001. He was a principal Crown Counsel in Tasmania. He has been a statutory member of the National Crime Authority. He's a part-time Deputy President and the Executive Deputy President for Tasmania of the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. He's conducted a number of independent inquiries, including into the Beaconsfield mine disaster and international work on behalf of Cricket Australia. He won't want me to say this, but Greg appeared for the Hughes family in the coronial inquiry after Phil Hughes's sad and tragic death on the field. And it was an enormously generous thing for him to do. He is the current Chief Commissioner of the Tasmanian Integrity Commission. But perhaps the best colour for Greg is red. Greg is a master judge of wine. He's a very successful winemaker. He and a partner have a well-named winery called Pressing Matters. He is, so if ever you see Greg, just look at the wine and say, well, haven't you got something better? Most appositely for today, Greg has been a member of the Council of the Australian War Memorial since 2015 and was reappointed at the end of last year. Greg is going to address us on lawyers in the military.
Yesterday, Gerard Henderson complained about the order in which he appeared on the Speaker's program. On the listing, at least he wasn't given the one on the Sunday morning after people have been kept up by that diabolical John Stone, drinking at all hours of the morning. I'm also a bit worried that one of yesterday's speakers has left his notes here in case I ran out of mine. Shows the amount of confidence they have in my presentation. This will not be anywhere near as erudite as some of the matters you've had before, but I thought on the 100th anniversary of the conclusion of World War I was appropriate we reflected upon the contributions made by lawyers during that conflict. I acknowledge that I've borrowed heavily from the works of Justice Berrett and Guard, Jeff Lindsay, as well as Tony Caneen, and of course that living national treasure, Les Carline. Just to start, part of the problem in Australia is we have not made a list of all the lawyers who fought in World War I. The British solicitors boards have actually compiled a list, and they know how many solicitors fought in World War I. Anybody care to hazard a guess how many people appear on that list? So it? It was actually 6,300, according to the list I've got. Maybe it was 20,000. Could be. And of course, I add to that list were barristers, and there were probably just as many barristers as well. In fact, a British barrister, Lieutenant Colonel Jasper Meyer Richardson, had the dubious honour of being the oldest man the British man to be killed in World War I, being killed 3 days short of his 69th birthday. One thing we've got to consider is that although not a protected profession, lawyers have always been prepared to enlist and made up a substantial number of leaders in all wars. As noted by Paul Brereton, the legal profession and profession of arms provide practitioners with skills and experience which serve each other well in each of the professions. To give you an example, New South Wales barristers served in the Second World War. There are about 300 who served in the Second World War, and at least 117 of them went on to become judges, including Chief Justice Sir Lawrence Whistler Street, Sir John Kerr, Sir Victor Windio, and Sir Victor Windio was awarded DSO and Bar and 3 mentioned dispatches in his very distinguished World War II service. Another former Chief Justice, Kenneth Whistler Street, fought in World War I, and Sir Edmund Herring is one of many distinguished judicial officers who also had a distinguished war service, having been awarded a military cross during World War I and made a commander of the British Empire and a distinguished service order during World War II. As we know from yesterday, Sir Ninian Stephen also served in World War II. Because of their leadership skills and education, lawyers often became leaders, which meant in World War I suffered disproportionate casualties, as the Germans concentrated on officers who were often distinguished by their uniforms, pistols and leadership activities. As you know, soldiers for millennia have always been trained to shoot the leaders of the opposing force. The casualty rate of lawyers has been about twice the average of the casualty rate amongst other professions. Part of the problem, of course, in World War I was that officers used to wear leather boots rather than leggings. They'd have a Sam Brown and they carried a pistol instead of a rifle. It wasn't long into the campaign before officers realised they had a better chance of surviving if they dressed like private soldiers. It's also relevant that ever since colonial days, lawyers have played an active part in militia and reserve forces, often rising into senior leadership roles. The trend still continues today, with 3 of the last 6 generals and admiral holding the position of the ADF's most senior reserve officers being members of the legal profession, including 2 current Supreme Court justices. Returning to World War I, it's worth noting the significant number of legal practitioners combined their professional lives with active involvement in the armed forces, which were in the main, in those days, comprised of part-time volunteers. Several significant wartime leaders included barristers James Gordon Legg, Henry Norm McLaurin, Pompey Eliot and James Mccoy. McLaurin was a highly regarded and energetic commander of the 1st Infantry Brigade who led his brigade ashore at Gallipoli. Unfortunately, his active service only lasted 2 days, being shot by a sniper on the ridge just beyond the beach. His grieving men named a hill at Gallipoli in his honour, which is still there. I'll discuss the other 3 later. Amongst the first 4 men to enlist in New South Wales was Geoffrey McLaughlin. He was a captain in the Australian Field Artillery with 5 years' service prior to the start of the First World War. His record is typical of so many of his peers. He embarked with the 1st Field Artillery Brigade, it's FAB, in Sydney on the 18th of October aboard the Argyll ship, destined for Egypt. During service at Gallipoli, he suffered jaundice and was evacuated to Malta in November 15 before rejoining his unit in Egypt, following the withdrawal from Gallipoli. It's worth noting that many people in World War I suffered quite a few diseases prior to embarking or after embarking. Captain McLaughlin was awarded the Military Cross in January 1916 for distinguished service in the field and was also mentioned dispatches. He was promoted to Major on the 12th of March 1916. When the brigade relocated to the Western Front during March and April 16, he was wounded in action near Fleurs in November 16 and then was evacuated to Rouen and then to England for treatment and recuperation. Couldn't keep him down, so in early April 17 he rejoined his unit near Amiens, where he took command of the Artillery Brigade with a temporary rank of Lieutenant Colonel for 3 months. He was again wounded in action during an attack by phosphine gas on the 2nd of November 1917, and he died of those wounds 2 days later in No. 2 Canadian Casualty Clearing Station and is buried in a military cemetery in Belgium. He was aged just 30 years. So he was one of the first 4 people to sign up in New South Wales. As an aside, for those of you who visit the Western Front and go to the cemeteries, there's a popular misconception that the cemeteries are where the battlefields were. In fact, they're usually where the casualty clearing stations were, where people were taken back to be assessed or confirmed as dead, and the front lines being somewhat further forward. Another example of a New South Welshman was Samuel Edward Townsend, who was living and enlisted in Western Australia. As Tony Canine notes, referring to a counter-attack to retake Quinn's post at Gallipoli, he said a 29-year-old barrister, Captain Samuel Edward Townsend, only arrived in Gallipoli a few hours earlier, led the charge. CWE Bean described his action in the final charge in some detail. With officers being shot all around, Townsend led the men over the parapet in the dark. He shouted to them, "Fix your bayonet," and told them, "When I call for Australia forever, charge, boys." Some were killed immediately. Townsend was wounded and then killed as he was carried out of the fight. In the same campaign on the 19th of May, the son of Justice Philip Whistler Street, a young Lawrence Whistler Street, was killed, once again bravely leading his men. And in the same campaign, the sons of Justice Simpson and Justice Rich were also killed. As noticed by Chief Justice Kiefel yesterday, other High Court judges were not immune to having their sons join the casualty list. A typical sample of a town and the sacrifice they made was Bendigo. There were 4 friends who joined up in Bendigo, and they were all members of the legal profession. And their stories are unfortunately only too typical of many young leaders in World War I. I'll now quote from a paper by Justice Gard, along with some additions, and this was a paper that Greg gave to Bendigo in November 2017. As he notes, war is a carnage, always terrible, often futile, and always wasteful, as the loss of these fine young men demonstrates. Clive, Eric, Allen and Murdoch, as I shall describe these outstanding young officers, had immense talent and capacity. At any other time, they would have lived productive professional careers and had a wonderful family life. They had the world in front of them and would have been judges, barristers, partners of legal firms and community leaders in Victoria. The tragedy and distress of their loss to their families and the community of Bendigo cannot be underestimated. By accident of history, they belong to a lost generation of young Australians who served in the Great War. And it's hard for us to understand the impact of a nation of only 5 million, in fact we were less than 5 million, to lose 60,000 dead, and several times that number maimed, injured or wounded. Captain Clive Connolly lost his life leading an attack during an important offensive. He was killed during the critically important attack on Hill 60, having returned from injury only 4 days early. He led a renewed attack on Hill 60 on the 28th of August 2015. Hill 60 was a ground of great tactical importance because it linked the Anzac beachhead with the landings by British forces at Suvla Bay. In leading the third attack, Clive knew this. He also knew that 2 previous attacks on Hill 60 had failed, that the Turks were fully alerted and reinforced, and almost certainly he and his troops would be subject to great loss of life. 3/4 of Clive's attacking force were quickly casualties. He himself was shot 3 times leading the attack. Unfortunately, also his younger brother, Major Eric Connolly, was wounded on Gallipoli. Subsequently, Eric was twice mentioned dispatched and awarded the Distinguished Service Order. Despite his repeated bravery in action, he almost survived the war, sadly being killed by a bomb dropped on the headquarters 3rd Division near Peronne in the Valley of the Somme only 2 months before the armistice. Lieutenant Alan Hyatt lost his life from artillery shell splinters when riding a bicycle between his unit and his divisional headquarters at the junction known as Hyde Park Corner. And note that he'd also been wounded several times and kept returning to his unit. And then there was Major Mccoy, who fought at Gallipoli and in the trenches in France during the Battle of Pozieres. He was rallying Australian soldiers for an attack on the German trenches when he was shot by machine gun fire. He was mentioned dispatches for his courage and actions. I'll come back a little bit later to Pozieres. There were over 23,000 casualties in that battle, 7,000 killed. And Charles Bean, as many of you probably know, described Pozieres as more densely sown with Australian sacrifice than any other place on earth. Another lawyer who had what we call an interesting war was Arthur Blackburn. Arthur Blackburn, along with another soldier as a private, was recorded as being the man who reached the furthest inland at Gallipoli on the 25th of April 1915. He was a 21-year-old lawyer who was amongst the first to enlist in the fighting 10th. And as a battalion scout, he was among the first to land at Anzac Cove. And as I said, Australia's First World War historian, Charles Bean, noted that Blackburn and Lance Corporal Robin probably made it further inland than any other Australian soldiers. He was commissioned as Second Lieutenant at Gallipoli in August 15, and there served the entire campaign. In July 16 at Pozieres, the 23-year-old Second Lieutenant led an attack for which he was awarded the Victoria Cross. Blackburn was directed with 50 men to drive the enemy from a strong point, and by great determination he captured 250 yards of trench after personally leading 4 separate parties of bombers against many of whom became casualties. Then after crawling forward with the sergeant to reconnoitre, he returned and attacked again and seized another 120 yards of trench to establish communication with the battalion on his left. Now, he returned to practice during the wars, but in the Second World War, he was promoted to Lieutenant Colonel and took command of a motorised cavalry regiment, the 18th Light Horse Machine Gun Regiment. And then he was appointed to command the 2nd 3rd Machine Gun Battalion that fought under his command in Syria against the Vichy French. And thereafter he landed with the smallest Australian force in Java, promoted to Brigadier and appointed to command Black Force. And he then became, of course, after that, a prisoner of war. It's interesting to note the 2nd 3rd Machine Gun Battalion was a combined South Australian and Tasmanian unit, and 3 of its officers won military crosses in World War II, including Tim Brenningham Moore, who later became a long-serving master and later judge of the Supreme Court of Tasmania. Tasmania had another interesting person sign up in the man who later became Sir Henry Seymour Baker. He enlisted at 24 in the AAF, joining the 13th Battalion. Being a journalist, he interestingly described what they went through when at the Claremont camp in Tasmania. Filled with newcomers myself, the roughest lot of chaps I'd ever been so near in my life before, mostly miners from the West Coast. 1 or 2 were fairly decent, but nearly all swore terribly and without ceasing. They never opened their mouths without using the most abominable language. He then went on and saying how he hated camp life in general and the absolute loss of individuality. If you read his diaries, it's quite amazing because he's, being an ex-journalist, they're very articulate and well written. In 1918, he was awarded the Distinguished Service Order for the following act of bravery. During the advance on the 18th September near Levigia, north of Mont St Quentin, he acted as a right-hand guide to his battalion despite the great difficulties caused by fog and uncut wire and heavy machine gun artillery fire, carried his duties in a most gallant and skillful manner. On reaching the first objective, he was sent ahead to reconnoitre and locate a large part of the enemy. He threw bombs at them and 20 surrendered. These he brought back with him, excuse me, and then got together a party of men again, attacked the enemy, taking further prisoners. At the first objective, he received a painful wound in the leg, but carried on right to the final objective. He behaved splendidly. After the war, he resumed his legal studies and was admitted to the Tasmanian Bar, and he was then elected to the House of Assembly and leader of the opposition before retiring in 1946. 2 years later, he decided to re-stand for the Legislative Council and was president of that house from 1959 to 1968. Another Tasmanian who joined up, who has a significant connection with this society, was Andrew Inglis Clark. But it wasn't the Andrew Inglis Clark, who was one of the founders of Samuel Griffith's The Constitution. It was his son of the same name, Andrew Inglis Clark Jr. He refused to take a commission because he distrusted officers. He was promoted temporary sergeant in January 1919 and mentioned dispatches. Despite his educational qualification and age, he made no apparent effort to obtain the commission and developed an extremely critical attitude towards officers, apparently, particularly English officers. I'll talk about some English officers shortly. He went on then to become a practitioner and an extremely good judge in Tasmania, very highly regarded Australia-wide, and should have been Tasmania's first, and we still haven't had one, appointment to the High Court. The reason he wasn't appointed to the High Court, according to many, was the fact there must have been something wrong with him because he had not been commissioned in World War I. Now, as mentioned, part of the problem was officers commanding as Australians, whether they be Australian or English. But we were unfortunate at Gallipoli to have had to fought for part of the campaign in the southern area under General Hunter, a British general called Hunter Weston, who's believed in full frontal attacks in broad daylight. And if the first attack failed, he'd try again the next day, but an hour later, just to make sure the enemy had an even better chance to be ready. He was so incompetent that when the British and Australian troops landed on the southern part of the Gallipoli Peninsula in an effort to take Crete, a British detachment had actually landed ashore at Y Beach, where the Turks weren't expecting anybody because it was so difficult, and were behind the Turkish lines and in a position to actually cause havoc. He saw them through his binoculars or telescope, thought it was outrageous that they disobeyed orders and gone ashore where they shouldn't have, and ordered them back. There was also Sir Richard Haking, who more than anyone was responsible for the madness at Fromelles. He never understood the new form of warfare, and he also didn't understand the effect of enfilade machine gun fire and barbed wire or heavy artillery bombardments, and always seemed to think that trenches could be taken by acts of character. One Australian lawyer and soldier who had significant problems with the British officers was Harold Pompey Eliot. Now, I'm going to plagiarise with permission from my friend Les Carlyon because he writes about these people far better than I could have. In his book, The Great War, he talks about Eliot and Fromelles. The Australian was Harold Pompey Eliot. The staff officer was Major HCL Howard from General Haig's headquarters. The three brigades of the 5th Australian Division would attack the left of Sugarloaf and the 61st British Division to the right at the salient himself. Howard had come in to report on the preparations for the attack. Now you've got to bear in mind, Fromelles was the first time the Australians were engaged on the Western Front. It was a feint to take pressure off and attack somewhere else. And of course, it was prepared in full view of the Germans who commanded the Heights, who were aware of everything they'd done in preparation. Eliot was commanding the 15th Brigade, and he wasn't impressed. As the pair walked back from the front line, Eliot produced a circular that had been sent out by Haig's headquarters. This tried to distill some of the lessons of the 2 years of trench warfare. It recommended that no assault should be made where the breadth of no man's land exceeded 200 yards. Eliot's 15th Brigade was being asked to cover twice that distance. Eliot conceded to Howard that he didn't know much about tactics on the Western Front. He'd been there only 10 days, and it was nothing like the crazy escarpments of Gallipoli, where neither side had so much heavy artillery, and the trench lines were often only a few yards apart. Then he told Howard what he thought. Eliot liked to tell people what he thought. The attack would fail, he said. What did Howard think? Howard knew much more about artillery than Eliot. He said he thought it would be a bloody holocaust. Eliot asked him to tell Haig this, and Howard agreed to do so. Eliot and Howard were alone. Howard never spoke publicly of the conversation, and we only have Eliot's account, and this is a pity. It would have been interesting to know what Howard made of the Australian. Eliot wasn't like other generals, English or Australian. Loud, dishevelled and cocksure. He's one of the true eccentrics of the Australian Army. Pompey was the nickname came from the big-hearted Carlton footballer, Fred Pompey Eliot, was admired and feared down the line by the enlisted men he roared at like a bull's thirsting for a gore. By the man he arrested or threatened to shoot, Eliot was forever on the edge of drawing a revolver, often for such heinous offences, smoking whilst on route march, and by the junior officers he taunted by telling them they weren't a wart on a soldier's arse, and who cared if corporals and privates could hear what he was saying. He bullied and blustered, but there was said to be fatherly quality about it. As several contemporaries can observe, other commanders tried to be disciplinarians and ended up being hated. Eliot did the same thing, and mostly found respect and sometimes affection. His men had their own fun with him. They paid newsboys in Egypt to stand outside a tent in the early hours of the morning and shout, "Egyptian Times, very good news, the death of Pompey the bastard." Maybe his men sensed that he cared, and he did. If there was a bombast, there was also generosity. Eliot wrote to his wife Kate, a soft beauty, that a private had died from pneumonia and he was such a good fellow. These tender letters to Kate sit curiously with his ravings on the parade grounds of Australia and Egypt. He wanted to gaze into her dear bright eyes and sunshine face and kiss her dear lips and cheek and chin. He liked children and referred to his young son and daughter as our dear little pets. He'd been an outstanding student at Melbourne University, took degrees in law and arts and shared the Supreme Court Prize for the top student in the final year law. He liked poetry, particularly Kipling, but he'd always known poverty in the red dust of a family farm at Charlton in Victoria's northeast, where he attended a one-teacher school and lived in a two-room hut of iron and bark. He won the Distinguished Conduct Medal for bravery as a corporal in the Boer War after he ran off enemy horses. On Gallipoli, where he commanded the 7th Battalion, was the old-fashioned leader, straight out of military romance, at the front with his men leading by example. He was shot in the ankle in the morning of the landing at Anzac Cove and lay for hours on the shingle of the beach, his foot throbbing. He fought at Lone Pine in August. The man next to him was shot and his head exploded. Eliot led his men covered in head to foot in blood and brains. Eliot survived the war, never forgave the superiors because of he was never promoted to Major General. He really got upset when people were promoted above him, but of course he upset everybody above him by telling what fools he thought they were, and he was usually right. Unfortunately, he committed suicide in 1931, and one of the obvious things was, of course, the casualties men suffered. He was seen standing in the trenches and visibly crying when the remnants of his brigade came back from Fromelles. Unlike Eliot, the commander of the 5th Division was disliked by just about everyone for most of his adult life. When James Whiteside Mccoy died in 1930, the bulletin first acknowledged that he was a born soldier and a brave man, then ran up to the point it really wanted to make. Nevertheless, he became the most detested officer in the AAF. At the early stage of the war, he remained, he started at the early stage of the war becoming the most detested man and remained so to the end. His career was unusual. He was at Fromelles, 51 years old, tall and with a wilting moustache, a Major General commanding division, having spent only 5 weeks or so of his life in action. Yet those weeks were tumultuous. They showed him to be about as brave a soldier as can be, and also a commander with a genius for alienating his men. He'd gone ashore with the 1st Division at Gallipoli and walked into a shambles. His 2nd Brigade was supposed to go left. Lieutenant Colonel Ewan Sinclair McLachlan, who landed first with his 3rd Brigade, told Mccoy to go to the right. Mccoy reluctantly agreed and walked into a bigger shambles. Battalions were mixed up, command structures had broken down, and some men had gone too far forward. Mccoy became crankier than usual. When Major General William Bridges, the divisional commander, came ashore with Brudenell White around 7:30 a.m, he found Mccoy unstrung. White said that Mccoy was completely lost. Bridges wanted to know what the hell he was doing. Bridges grew angry, and White said he saw Mccoy's face change. He began to get a grip on himself, and before long was in complete control. We should not judge Mccoy for this. The shambles would have tested any commander. 2 bullets passed through his cap that morning, another through his sleeve. But he did not help himself. He accused rankers of cowardice and threatened them with a revolver. It was that style of man that offended: the threats, the sarcasm, the prisoners and the schoolmaster, and the pedantry of the lawyer. Mccoy could put the wind up men, he could not inspire. Earlier on the 2nd of May, the 2nd Brigade was sent south to the British beachhead at Cape Helles. Major General Almere Hunter Weston, the senior British officer there, wanted to try again to capture the village Griffith. Hunter Weston was one of the Great War's spectacular incompetents. Haig called him an amateur, others said he was a music hall general. At least twice during the war he went off his head. He bubbled cheery humour and threw troops away as lesser men turned away socks. He sent Mckay's troops into the battle late in the third day, telling him to advance on Krithia. And there was no time to organise anything. Not that this would have made much difference. The attack was suicidal and half the Australians involved were killed or wounded. Mckay's Brook Brigade took more than 1,000 casualties. And unfortunately, as a result of that, the Australians blamed Mccoy, which was unfair because he had to do as he's told by Hunter Weston. We started late. I'm not going to. There were a couple more I was going to talk about, which I won't, because we have several more speakers today. I just want to finish off by noting that there is yet another connection between lawyers and World War I and this society. An artillery major by the name of Major William Ellis Cox, on the 8th of August 1918 at the Battle of Amiens, disobeyed a direct order. He was ordered not to fire over the left flank where the British were supposed to be and not to engage in counter-battery fire. On seeing heavy casualties being incurred by a German battery, he disobeyed those orders, knowing the British as usual would be late anyway and he wouldn't be firing over them, and he took out the German battery. For that he was awarded a military cross. He later became a judge of the Supreme Court of Tasmania. His son, William John Ellis Cox, was also a distinguished soldier, albeit in peacetime. He commanded the 16th Field Regiment in Tasmania, an artillery unit, taking after his father's footsteps. And Bill went on to become Chief Justice of Tasmania and then Governor. And of course, it was he who'd addressed the dinner of this organisation in its function in Hobart in 2011. So once again, another full circle has been completed. Thank you.